Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar in our spring series, which is about uncovering Jewish history, which is going to be focused on lesser known Jewish histories and lesser known aspects of what we understand to be Jewish history. I'm incredibly honored and excited that we're here with Louis Gordon, who is an Afro-Jewish philosopher, political thinker, educator, and musician. Born on the island of Jamaica and grew up in the Bronx. His research is in Africana philosophy, philosophy of existence, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, philosophy of culture, aesthetics, philosophy of education, and philosophy of science. And among many, many other accomplishments, he founded the Center for Afro-Jewish Studies at Temple University. He currently teaches at the University of Connecticut, and I'm so honored and excited that you're here with us today. We're really hoping that this will be a discussion rather than a presentation. So if folks who are here with us could just say in the chat where you're from and like where you're Skyping, or not Skyping, Zooming in from, that can kind of get us started. I have a couple questions to get us started, but once the floor is actually open, so if you have questions, please put them in the chat. For folks who are new to the software, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a button that says chat. And then you can also click the button in the chat that says, it defaults to all panelists, but if you click on the button there, you can see all panelists and attendees, and then everyone can see who you are. So Annie Kaufman is saying that she's in Chicago and that this is exciting. Hi, Annie.
Hi,
Good to
Annie.
see you. Giving other folks a moment to introduce themselves. Ruben is here, who is our Midwest regional organizer, Black Jew, live in Detroit, on a plane. So excited that you're here for 5 minutes. Thank you.
In
Elaine
Brooklyn.
in Brooklyn. Ben in LA, Elaine in Austin, Ari in Brooklyn, Joan in Sonoma. And for folks who don't know, my name is Tali. Sorry, I meant to do that in the beginning. I'm the Research and Education Manager here at JVP. I'm in Oakland, California. So I'll let folks introduce themselves a bit, and I'm going to get us started. My first question actually is to ask you a question about the term Afro-Jewish and what you saw as why that term and not Black Jews or other kinds of terms that we might use to describe what you're talking about.
Okay. Well, the first thing is that Black and African are not the same thing. And the complicated thing about the question of how, oops, let me turn off my phone. Oh. The complicated thing about African is that historically, oh, hello there. The complicated thing about the category Black is that it has many connotations, but the specific type that's used in terms of racial connotations emerge out of Euro-modernity, whereas Africa actually precedes Euro-modernity. In fact, many people don't even know that Africa is an African word, just to give you an idea. It simply means from the womb or from the source. Now, the thing is that I also use the term Afro-Jewish. I could say Black Jew, I am a Black Jew, but the truth is there's something more radical. I actually take the position that Jews are not white. So that's actually even more radical. But so what I try to do is to pick a term that would enable people to ask questions. So one of the things, we have as Jews is we're supposed to be asking questions all the time. We don't only do it at Seder's, but we are in fact a constant question. And so it's in the spirit of Judaism that I use a designation and would have people ask about Jewish people, Jewish history, etc. In terms of the center, that actually emerged from when I created Center for Afro-Jewish Studies. And it was very funny. There's a reporter who interviewed me once, and she asked why not call it the Center for Jewish Diversity or that sort of a thing. And I said that's because most Jews are actually ignorant of Jews. Mm-hmm. If you say this Jewish diversity, they say, oh, you mean Ashkenazi and Sephardi? You see? And a lot of them don't understand Mizrahi, Koshin, Lemba. They don't understand Abu Yudaya, the whole broad range of Jewish people. But even with that, they don't even understand how the category Jewish people was even formed. because a lot of people work within the framework of the internal discussion of what you have in shul or temples or synagogues, or in other words, in the mythic discourse, but they don't know the historic discourse. So one of the things I like about saying Afro-Jewish studies is that it compels people to ask the question, what does it mean not only to be Black or of African descent, but also it makes people ask, what is a Jew, etc. It also is cool because it enables me to also talk about ancient Jewish history. A lot of people don't know how African Judaism is. And a lot of people act as if Judaism sprung out of Europe. And so it affords an opportunity to have a very constructive conversation on the complexity of how Jewish people were formed.
Thank you so much. I really liked that understanding of sort of the pre-European modernity, I should say, sort of tracing that back. I think that's really powerful. I think in our contemporary moment, my second question, it's very, very hard for people to imagine the existence of Jewish people who are not of European descent. And so I guess my question is, why do you think that is, or what came out, like, why did that come about? And this might be related a little bit to what you were saying about Jewishness and whiteness.
Well, actually, the way it came about is absolutely normal if we take the blinders off of a very basic concept that we often don't talk about when we talk about Jewish history. And this concept is linked into something that many groups talk about. It's not only Jews, it's connected to many ethnic, racial groups. And that is, there's an effort to try to talk about the formation of people without at all looking at the history of imperialism, the history of colonialism, etc. And what's bizarre about that is Jewish history is a long history of colonialism. And there are reasons for why people want to evade that issue. But the short answer is very straightforward. Let's not talk about Jews for a second. Let's just pick the category Black, okay? Many people who are designated Black in the rest of the world notice that whenever most of the world today talk about Black people, they're talking about US Black people. Mm-hmm. Yet the majority of Black people are not in the US. In fact, in the Americas, the largest Black populations are in South America. Brazil has more Black people in the United States than the United States has. So why is it when we talk about Black people, everybody's talking about the United States? And the simple answer is because the United States, for a time, now that Russia and China are displacing it, were the hegemonic centers. So the basic thing is, if you look at the story of Blacks, prior to the centeredness of the US, it was the British Empire. The Blacks in the British Empire was the voice of Black people. And prior to that, it was the Spanish Empire. And then prior to that, there were the different African empires, but they weren't, the people there weren't considered Black peoples. There were people who would be part of Yoruba, Telensi, Songhai, the different worlds on the African continent. And they had their own areas of political hegemony, etc., particularly in East Africa. A lot of people don't realize that, for instance, a lot of the Indian Ocean was actually dominated by East African peoples. And I don't mean it just simply their numbers. I'm talking about governing. So part of it is connected to a form of ignorance. And the simple answer is this. If you look at Jewish history, it's the same thing. Whichever Jews are at the center of an empire, they become the Jews. You see, and I always remind people that many people think their Jews are the Jews, when in fact there's a plurality of Jews. However, if you look at this history, periods in which, for instance, there was the various Syrian and Greek control of certain parts of the Mediterranean, those Jews dominated. Then Roman, and in fact, it's through the Romans that what many people call Jewish today actually emerged. But during the period of Roman domination, those were the Jews. And then when the caliphates emerged, Arabic-speaking Jews dominated. A lot of people forget, for instance, Rambam or, Maimonides basically wrote exclusively in Arabic. That was a different world. And then, of course, as the Iberian areas began to assert themselves and push out the Afro-Islamic and Afro-Jewish groups who were predominantly Arabic speaking. Then there were the Sephardi, and the Sephardic groups were for a long time the Jews. In fact, what's really funny is when you look at Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, today a lot of people tend to cast Ashkenazic characters to play Shylock. Shylock was a Sephardic Jew. He was not an Ashkenazi Jew. And Shylock, properly portrayed, would look more like me. And in fact, if you read, for instance, Machiavelli's The Prince, where the Moors and the Jews from that period were described, that's what they look like. But then, as we know, then there's the ascent of the Portuguese, followed by the French, followed by the British. And then during the period of the British Empire, there was a different group of Jews who began to dominate. And then there were the complex questions around the collapse of Prussia and the emergence of the fusing of Eastern Germany and, you know, the whole formation of Germany. And those Jews became the Jews. And then eventually, as we know, something more complicated happened, because you see, in the past, the empires were very different. The empires were not racially inflected. However, Euromodernity began to create a racially inflected empire. And within that framework, different groups of Jewish people were located at these various empires. However, in Europe specifically, they were categorical about this. Jews were just not white. However, many people who were not white in Europe or not white in North Africa, in the colonies, there was a little more fluidity with this. And so what happened is that in some of the colonies, a sort of bidding to get a sort of tenuous white status emerged. Of course, this began to create a form of segregation in many synagogues. But it's a mistake to focus on synagogues, because again, that's part of Jewish myth. Jewish myth is to present our history as if we were all religious, you know, devoted, synagogue-going people, when in fact, in a world that was racially inflected, a lot of Jewish identity was racial ethnic. And so their identities functioned in a very fluid way. However, in the Americas, but particularly in the United States, once the United States was formed, something new happened. If you look at a lot of the records in the early colonies before there was a United States of America, nearly all the records of the people who were found who were Jews were outside of the category of whiteness. In fact, the first recorded Jew was a fellow by the name of Solomon, who the reason he's recorded in the colonies was because he was arrested. And he was arrested because the Christians said he was working on the Sabbath. And in his defense, he had to explain that's not his Sabbath, that, you know, his was the day before. But he was described, and he was a black man. And this was in New Hampshire. And anyway, so within that framework, what became a big shift was twofold. If you use the US context as the model, and the reason it's very important to use the US context is because it affected Canada, Australia, South Africa, and many other places that eventually became post-colonial environments. The United States offered this idea of freedom of religion, but full citizenship was racial. So if you could demonstrate you were white, then you can have full citizenship. However, the problem was Jews looked at as a racial ethnic group could not be white. So it became a real investment in Jewish history, particularly in North America and certain parts of Europe where migration was planned, to transform Jewish identity exclusively into a religious identity, and then say you're of European descent and therefore you're white. However, this required ignoring all these other Jews who were coming from all over the place. And so increasingly, as those Jews began to invest more in a whitening project for full citizenship, they began to invest increasingly in the religiosity of Judaism. There's one thing that I should add to this. One fallacy that many people make when they study race is to presume that everybody has a race for whiteness. But actually, one of the things I learned, particularly in the Center for Afro-Jewish Studies, is that the fluidity of Jewish people is such that we tend to take on different identities external to our Judaism wherever we go. So there are Jews in some places who look like me who are designated white, and Jews who look like you in other places who are designated black. And I've often joked to people, if you look at some of the pictures of early black, a lot of black activists in the 19th and early 20th century, they just look like Jews. They look like light-skinned Jews, olive-skinned Jews, etc. And if they were posing in a picture with other Jews, some people would say they can't even tell who are the Jews there. So the complicated thing, especially with my family, because my family were a mixture of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, but my family, because a lot of them moved around through the British Empire, they had different racial designations where they landed. So if my great-grandmother, for instance, had landed in Boston, went to Boston, then she would have had a white designation. But because she was in Jamaica, she had a black designation, but looking the same, morphologically the same. And it's really striking once we begin to understand it, because if you look at us, and all you have to do is look at popular culture. Everywhere you go, there are people who have ascended in the culture as the local, who turn out to be Jewish people. Do you see what I'm getting at? And so race with Judaism is very fluid. And one of the things that we have to do is to understand that it's not as neat to saying black Jew, white Jew, etc. Even a person designated a white Jew in the United States might be a black person in another country, and vice versa.
So I have a couple of other questions, but I actually want to open it up to see what folks have in terms of questions, or, and we can follow this thread, or if folks have other questions on other topics. We really invite any questions at this moment. Giving folks a minute to gather their thoughts on the topics of race and Jewishness and Jewish history.
Well, let me say something that might be of interest to some about race and Jews, because a lot of people don't know this. You know, the term race has its origin in the Iberian term raza.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if you look at the 10th century dictionaries, the term raza referred to Jews and Moors. And so what's funny is, although there's a lot of Jewish history that is about trying to escape the category of race, Jews are intimately linked to the formation of race.
It does become very difficult to kind of hold it all in one's head, right? That we have a religious identity and an ethnic identity, but also a multiracial, multi-ethnic group of people that, as you're saying, sort of identities shift and change over time and over place. That I think many of us who are working and living in the US and are activists in the United States, it's a slippery topic to kind of wrap our heads and minds around. So I'm really hopeful that folks have questions. Even there are no dumb questions. Let's just be very honest. Even very simple questions can be very great.
Do remember too, my view of a professor is just a professor is an advanced student. So I'm not a know-it-all.
So as folks get their questions together, I read the article that we circulated on Rarely Kosher is what it's called. And one of the things that really struck me is you mentioned something about the kinds of anxieties that people have, people who don't understand that Jews are a multiracial, multi-ethnic people, have once meeting Afro-Jews or Black Jews, and specifically around the Jewish future, like what the sort of anxieties around that. And my question is, what do you imagine the Jewish future to be? Sort of putting their anxieties aside for a second, what does that phrase mean to you?
Well, I mean, the short version is that the Jewish future means there's a future with Jews in it. And this is connected to something people don't think about, which is the concept of modernity. I usually define modern as belonging to the future. And the presupposition when certain forms of modernity were emerging was that the future would be a future without Jewish people. Now, if there's a future without you, that means retroactively your present becomes illegitimate, because it means one has to look back at the present as saying it's a mark of your extinction, which means, of course, then you look into your past, and your past has to have certain flaws. So the question then becomes, if you're going to belong to the future, who exactly are the you who will be belonging? Oh, hello, Joan Maisel. And so the first thing to bear in mind is that I'm a critic of authenticity narratives. It seems to me that whatever the people are who will be in the future who are called Jews, they could only be there if they have a living Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the reason Judaism has been able to survive to this point is because of the creativity of Jewish people to create living Judaisms. Now, of course, there's always the individual who would try to rewrite the past into a closed authenticity narrative. However, that often involves a lot of misrepresentation. For example, most Jewish people don't know that Jewish people properly speaking, began to emerge not more than about 2,000 years ago. That prior to that, there were Judeans and different groups of people, and that was more an ethnic designation, and they practiced patrilineality, not matrilineality. Matrilineality came out of the Roman Empire, okay? The second thing, among readings, if you'd like to check into that, is Shia Cohen's wonderful book, The Beginnings of Jewishness. I just saw Max Greenberg's question there, that's why I said that. The thing that's crucial here, though, is that there are very specific historical events that led to the formation of Jewish people proper. And this is the thing a lot of people don't understand. A crucial thing, as we all know, is the fall of the Second Temple. Okay, but a lot of the story came through the formation of the Second Temple. And a lot of people, in other words, the Hasmonean Empire, issues like, this is kind of, for some people, dry historical stuff, but it's connected to why we celebrate Hanukkah. Because you see, this is actually where the action begins to shift. Because you see, Judean people and the various people in the area who are Northeast African peoples, they did not have the concept of religion. Okay, in other words, to be a Judean, to be like a lot of the people who are in what today is known as Canaan, it was a lot like saying you're Yoruba, Ibu, or that sort of identity, where you're sacred and your other customs were one. Romans had a concept of religion. They call it religare, and where you can relegate, and it was connected to reading certain practices. And Romans basically had this view, and again, it's similar to the story I told about the United States. Romans had this view where it's cool what you do, just pay your taxes. And so now, once it was clear that the peoples in the Levant and those areas were going to be colonized by the Romans, they got into a very important debate. And this is a debate that we see happening all over the world over the past several hundred years. But we could think about it even I brought up Yoruba, people such as people in Nigeria. Whenever people are colonized, you pretty much hear this debate. Let's get rid of the colonizers and go back to the way we were. Right? That's one position. Another position is, yeah, but the colonizers got some cool stuff. Why don't we create a hybrid? Why don't we just have a mixture of what we do and some of what the colonizers have? And then you have some of those who say, you know what? Let's just get rid of who we are and just be like the colonizers. And some people, as we know, in the midst of this hybrid mixing of trying to find a way to be both Roman and Judean, we know that's part of the formation of Christianity. Early Christianity just saw themselves as Jewish people with the Messiah having arrived. But then there were other groups of people who began to see that there's some other cool things that you could bring into Judaism that could help Jewish people. And among them was the notion of conversion. Because you see, before a non-Judean became part of the community through marriage. But the idea of ritualistic converting people into a religion, that's something peculiarly Roman. And one of the things that's very interesting about that is it made those early group of Judeans proselytizers. Here's how good they were. Romans kept a lot of excellent census. And again, you could check this in the Shia Cohen book. There are other books you could check this in. But a lot of people don't know that there are great rabbinic texts that chronicle this, particularly rabbinic historians. But before 50 years before the fall of the Second Temple, the Roman census had about 150,000 Judeans. Within 100 years of the fall of the Second Temple, are you ready for this number? 8 million Jews. Now I know we can be fruitful and multiply, but I very much doubt 150,000 people could produce 8 million in that short a time. And the reason is we were converting a lot of people to Judaism. And then you have to ask the next question, well, who were these people? Well, all you got to do is look at what the Roman Empire was at that time. The Roman Empire reached as far north as Britannica, as far south as the beginning of the Sahara Desert, as far east as Afghanistan into India, and as far west all the way over to Gibraltar. All right, and these were multiracial peoples. The Roman Empire. It's like asking what's the race of the Manhattanites today. Okay, and so all those people were becoming Jews, and what created a big shift? And I saw a question earlier about DNA testing and this kind of stuff. Well, you see, what changed a lot of things was the 4th century. When Constantine became emperor and he became a Christian, there were edicts, there were laws forbidding the conversion of people in the Roman Empire to Judaism. Once, and I'm talking about serious forbidding, like punishable by death. So now think about this. Okay, you could say then you're not going to go through ritualistic practice and put people in the mikveh and make them Jews. You could say this. But what are you going to do about marriage, since the old conversion practice was marriage? It meant that if you married a non-Jew and made that person a Jew, it's punishable by death. So that now created the notion that Jews should only marry Jews. It was a survival mechanism, but it wasn't a Jewish position. And as you know, if 8 million people are just constantly only marrying each other, except for those who go way out to the frontier end of empire, then what happens at that point is that you begin to have a lot of genetic similarity. And that's why we now have this reality that a lot of Jewish people across morphological lines have a lot of genetic connection. My wife and I, for instance, it's hilarious. My kids always go, "Oh!" My wife and I took a picture. My wife is, her parents were South African, descended from people from Lithuania and Germany. And it's pretty clear, that the longer history probably goes to Persia and other places. But what's hilarious is one day we took a picture, because I always crack up that my wife and I look a lot like the way we separately looked in our adolescent years. We look like cousins. And so I took a picture one day and our kids looked at it and they were like, oh, that's disgusting. And we're like, we're probably cousins of some ways, in some kind. And there are many people today, as they take genetics tests, etc., are just realizing that if a group is constantly marrying members of their own group, eventually there's a lot of connected strains. And there are other things that work themselves out. For instance, diseases, unfortunately, particularly among Sephardic Jews, diabetes, other things, about Tay-Sachs, etc. But it's not because of a mythic, pure Jewish origin, because even Judea that area of the world had people moving through. It was a trade area, but it's just from a lot of marrying in, among the group that created this. And this is why the Beta Israel, for instance, Ethiopian Jews had a rule at a certain point. The 13 generations rule. Okay, if you're a Beta Israel, if you're in Ethiopia and you're going to get married to someone who's from the Beta Israel community, you have to show that you're not related 13 generations back. Oh, I can't hear your voice. Oh, your voice went away.
I'm muted so that
okay.
to not interrupt your...
Anyway, I'm going on and on, but you can see the point.
Yeah.
That there are explanations for a lot of these things we have, But the problem is there are people who would like to have ideological explanations, which is, and you should always be suspicious of neat narratives, a kind of a
Yes.
linear line of people moving and migrating and they all stay as one. That's bunk.
Okay. So Farron's asking this question in the chat. This is something I haven't actually heard of, and maybe that's for the best, but apparently there's this theory that all Ashkenazi Jews are actually descendants of Khazars. Am I even saying that right?
Yeah,
Converted to
Khazars.
Judaism in the 19th century or something, and people use it as a reason to delegitimize Zionism. So the question was, what do you think of this theory and how that's used to delegitimize the Jewishness of Ashkenazi Jews in particular? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, and
Okay.
it's a very well known story. There
Okay.
was the problem with that story is the story I just told you.
Right.
They're already from antiquity by the period by the third century ACE. There were already more than 8 million Jews on the European side. So that doesn't work. The thing is, those people weren't Ashkenazi or Sephardi because those are concepts that took, in one case 800 years to form, the next one 1500 years to form.
Mm-hmm.
So that's retroactively rewriting the past. In the past, there were just actually some people didn't even use the term Jews. Jews was the term used that came out of the Roman Empire. Okay, there were people who used Israelites. There are people who would say Judean. There are some people who didn't even use any of those other terms because they would refer to themselves according to the different ethnic groups they were located in, but they will identify their practices. So this connected to groups who were formed, for instance, among the Yemeni, the different Arab communities. If you talk about the Berber communities, there were just so many. If you go along the trade routes of China, what eventually to the Kaifeng people. So the sad thing is too many people are not knowledgeable
Yeah.
of the many strains of Jewish people. But if we start now about Ashkenazi Jews, there is an ideological thing about Ashkenazi Jews. What it really is it's an effort to say European Jews without saying the word white.
Mm.
Okay, but even there, that doesn't really work because you see the history of Europe. Since those Jews were not considered white, their fluidity of mixing with other Jews was greater than when white designation emerged. Because think about it, if you think primarily as being Jewish, then if another Jew shows up, then it's just the person's a Jew. However, if you think of yourself as white, if another Jew shows up, you're going to look at that Jew's color. You're going to see if that Jew is blonde or whatever, etc. I gave a talk in New York City once where a man did one of those genetics tests, and both his parents were from Poland. And he was shocked to find out that on both sides, about roughly 300 years ago, everything pointed to Ethiopia on both sides. Now, try to think about that. If you think about places such as Vilna or port cities that were at certain periods of hospitability to Jews, if you are a Jew in Addis Ababa, or you're a Jew in a part of Zimbabwe, or you're a Jew in part of Yemen, or Sudan, and your life sucks. It's not going well, and you hear that it's a little better for some Jews in another place. You might go along the trade routes, show up, and say, "Here I am." And then the other Jews may say, "There you are," and they may even say, "You do things a little different. You seem ancient. You seem older in your practices. You're absorbing. You get married. Blah 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 blah." And before you know it, that genetic line is there. What a lot of people don't know about, though, the migration of Jews is, and again, they don't think logically. If you think about roughly the years 300 to about, roughly speaking, about 1700 ACE, migration and trade were very dangerous affairs. So often communities would consist of men who would go to stake things out. These men, if they were a sufficient number, and they usually were, to form a minyan, would begin to start a Jewish community. Of course, because they're Armenian, and if there was a sufficient someone who could function as the religious leader, in other words, a rabbi, um, eventually some of these men may decide to get married, and they would convert the local women. And so by the time it was safe enough for other Jewish families to show up, lo and behold, they show up and their Jewish families waiting for them. This is in how the San Francisco Jewish community was formed. That's why, Levi went out there and he wanted to sell tents. People didn't need tents, they needed strong pants. So he took tent material and created jeans. And that began to form Jewish communities there. There are many stories like this. Of course, in some parts of the world where, for instance, polygamy is practiced or polygyny, the richer some of these men got, the many wives they had. And that led to larger amounts of Jewish communities in those areas. And these are stories that people don't talk about, but people like me go and look up those histories. And so basically, the Ashkenazi story, it's not as neat. Remember I said we have to be careful of these very neat stories, like a Russian czar decides to tell people to convert, and there were conversions. There were Russian conversions. It's totally true. There are many parts of the world where there were periods of conversion. There just wasn't that many conversions to create that many Jews who we call Ashkenazi Jews. And among the Ashkenazi Jews, a lot of Ashkenazi Jewish women, when they do take these DNA tests, they reveal no mitochondrial DNA connection to Africa or the Middle East. Okay, whereas the males, they tend to, and that's why there's such an obsession, for instance, with the coenine line, because you can trace Y chromosomal line in a certain way, but it matches the story I'm telling you, because if the migration tend to be done more by men, then the people who tend to be linked to what would be the more ancient communities of people who practice Judaism, it's more likely to be along the Y chromosomal line, and that turns out to be true. That poses a problem, though, for religious Jews, because they have premised Jewish authenticity on the mother. But most Ashkenazi Jews, then, the precious matrilineal line is from a convert.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Offering space for more questions. I'm sure people have them. I have a question, but I'm waiting to give space to other folks. Again, no dumb questions. Okay. So Annie, I think, sorry, your name got cut off a little bit. These genetic narratives don't tell us about cultures, languages, practices, philosophies, ways of living. How did they interact? Is the question. Thanks, Annie.
And that's a beautiful question.
Such a good question.
Thank you for asking it. Earlier when I was talking about living culture, what made the community, when you asked about the Jewish future, and I think it's connected to our, not only our openness, but there are two things I'm very critical of. I'm critical about, for instance, the way we talk about anti-Semitism. And part of it is anti-Semitism is part of the investment that's linked not only to the religious narrative, because then it gives the idea that Jews are hated because of Jewish religion. Mm-hmm. But it's also connected to a narrative that goes away from something very important in the history of Judaism, which Judaism is also a history of liberation. It's okay. And so here's the why I bring up this distinction is very crucial, because you see the people who hate Jews, many of them don't even know what Jewish religion is. They really hate, they think about us biologically, actually. But once we begin to ask ourselves, then what do we do? The problem when we're linked in the anti-Semitism narrative is we often make it a negative. In other words, to be connected to Judaism as a matter of survival. But what we fail to understand are the beautiful things in Judaism. So often when I speak in synagogues, I try to talk about why I love Judaism. Okay, and I don't mean it ideologically, but I could have been a born Jew saying, keep it away from me. But but no. When I was in my younger years, I didn't really care much for a lot of the religious stuff at all. For me, it was more like a racial ethnic thing, because we didn't practice conversion in Jamaica. It was just you're a Jew, that's it. But once when I mentioned being Jewish and people began to ask questions, because in the United States, you meet a lot of people who are white unless you go into an area where there are a lot of Black Jews. Mm-hmm. I began to develop responses in a way that led to studying more the various communities and studying also Talmudic writings and other things. And I got to tell you where Judaism got me, and this is where there's difference, okay? There are many there are connections around Judaism if we talk about Torah, if we talk about certain basic practices, but there's a lot that's very different. Some Jewish communities are more patrilineal oriented, even if it's through the mother. They tend to focus more on the father. Some focus more on the mother. There are all kinds of foods that may be different, etc. However, the basic underlying philosophy of Judaism comes out, and I think for me, what got me in love with Judaism, and this is not in Torah, this comes out of Talmud, because I used to be critical of rabbinic Judaism, okay, is the Jewish position on death. Because a lot of people don't know this story, but Jewish funerals used to be lavish. People used to try to outdo each other, spend as much money, you know what I mean? Unfortunately, this is coming back not through funerals, but through bar mitzvahs, which is terrible. It's terrible. It's absolutely horrible. But it got to the point that it was so expensive that when some people's relatives died, the family would just move away and leave the body. And the rabbis got together and argued that that was disgraceful. It lacked dignity. And so it was agreed that Jewish burial funerals must be as simple as possible. They must be kosher. They must remind you about ultimately what it is to respect the dignity of other people, even in death. And for me, that's one of the most beautiful, even when I talk about it, it almost gets me teary-eyed. For me, it's one, at that moment, I'm like, okay, I'm in love. I'm in love. This is it. This is it. I'm down with this. And then you begin to think about the other thing. For instance, then I totally rethought Judaism. You know what I mean? For instance, again, there are lots of things people don't get. But for me, at a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah service where you're having the ritual in the Saturday service, to have a child carry the Torah. A lot of people don't understand what this is. It's about taking the responsibility for the responsibility of the image of God on earth, okay? And that is, to see a child do this is so powerful. And it struck me that ultimately this understanding, and this is what I see with Jewish people all over the world, that it's not, a lot of non-Jews don't understand what we mean when we talk about election. They think we're saying that we're better than other people. We're not saying that. In fact, there are too many Jewish stories of running away from God. It's about the challenge of taking the responsibility to carry ethical life itself. And that is an extraordinary position to take. And it's something that we share beyond Jews. As a Jew, you're obligated to take the responsibility to relate also to non-Jews with this. The cultural things that are really cool, once you realize this, is if you keep sight of what is the ethical part, we have to remember next that the argument about death is connected to the argument about life. Judaism is about life. And when we understand what's about life, we understand just the way those ancient Jewish communities found a way to create a vibrant living form that they could build, that we can embrace. We have a similar obligation. And so there are all kinds of things. I'll give you an example, though, a very specific thing. My family, as you find out, my background is Mizrahi and Sephardic. My wife is background what people call Ashkenazic today. So she, so you could imagine what our Seder is like. Okay?
I bet the food is good.
Food is great. The food is fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous. But and I don't mess around. There's a kosher Syrian butcher who's a good friend of mine he always finds a goat or lamb for me. So at our Seder we have goat, and the shank is an actual, and I do the cooking because we go for, there. Think about this. Think about, for instance, you can make matzo ball soup, But you could also make matzo ball soup where you throw in some cilantro, some lime juice, some cumin, and you got a Mexican style because of it. Yeah, there are all kinds of cool things that you could do. Many practices, for instance, a lot of people don't know how much of reggae, a lot of Caribbean stuff, a lot of people don't know how much Judaism had to do with it. So there are times where, for instance, we would use reggae liturgies. And I'll give you an example. Or if you listen to Abba Yudaya, they sing they sing the Shema, they sing all of this, but done with the Ugandan inflections. Each Jewish community can claim it in a very special way. And, I just said something that was a bit of a teaser there. A lot of people don't know that the advisor to Marcus Garvey was a rabbi from Ethiopia, it's Rabbi Ford, and that the formation of early Rastafari was actually out of Judaism. Yeah, and the shift that went to the more Christological Rastafari came later, but the early Rastafari was entirely coming out of Afro-Jewish communities, African Jews, and this is one of the reasons why it led to pointing to Haile Selassie, but Haile Selassie wasn't his name. A lot of people don't know among the Beta Israel, Mekanin is a Jewish name. And his name was Tafari Mekanin. So he was born Jewish. It's just that the British Empire would not work with a head official of Ethiopia who was not part of the Abyssinian church. And so, although he practiced kashrut, when he was crowned emperor, he chose the name Haile Selassie to be in negotiations with the British because it's translated means Hail the Trinity. So he was publicly presenting himself as a Christian, though his origins was part of the Jewish community. So those are some examples.
Yeah, I think that part of my inspiration for putting on this series is that I think that is actually a very quintessential Jewish story. And
Totally.
yet that's not the story we tell or the story we learn about or the story we understand to be Jewish. And so that's so much of what I wanted to get out of this whole series, is to understand how much Jewish history is the history of the world, the history of these migrations and movements and empires and all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, and they're in many ways. I mean, the Koshin Jews were from First Temple Judean groups, but then there are these other Indian Jews from the Sassoon period, the Sephardic Jews who went in along the Silk Route, where that's how the Kaifeng were formed. The Lemba are descendants of Yemeni Jews, and then there are all these other strains. But the thing about it is that we have to bear in mind that as we travel, we have to make do. I've seen situations where a ritual was needed, but you don't have all the things. But the idea is you can put together what is there. If you don't have grapes, you use acai berries. If you find a way to make the thing, and that's the main thing. The spirit of Judaism is ultimately both life-affirming, but it's also very pragmatic.
Yeah.
The idea is make it work.
Completely. Okay, still open questions for folks. I can see some very smart people in I know some of these participants. I know they're very smart. And you can ask any question, offering that up for folks for our last about 10 minutes of this time together. Giving people a minute. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask one more question, but still keeping my eye on the chat, which is I've been noticing in my conversations with sort of younger, more activist Jews, there's a lot of conversation and like deep thinking. Oh, here's a question. Isn't the Western imperial historiography that re-narrates Jewish history before the fall of the Second Temple another kind of authenticity narrative that displaces indigenous communal narratives and self-understandings? Is a question from Ben in the chat.
Thanks, Ben. The short answer is yes. In fact, the very notion Western's a fiction. Western emerged in the 19th century as a concept. It's completely fictitious. And there are certain other periods in which there's a constant search for a particular classical past. the complicated thing is that a lot of what we call Western historiography came out of Christian historiography, but it was full of anxiety because the problem that Christianity always had is that it has this book where it wants to say it has part two, and it wish it didn't have part one, and it's a much transformed part one. But the problem is it wants to say that part two came out of part one. But the problem with Christianity was Christianity got rid of some important elements through which one could become a Christian that required delinking itself from Jews. And so part of the issue then was how to retell the past. But here's the problem. If you follow the actual history of part one, all of the arrows of part one point to an African history, but the people who were by this time doing historiography wanted to rewrite all history as white. And so this problem was this Jewish history was just so steeped in African that it had to whitewash Africa itself. The fact of the matter is, if you think of ancient Africa, those ancient peoples had no reason to use geopolitical boundaries like the ones we have in our maps today. It's not like you're walking around and living in the Horn of Africa and all the way towards Egypt, and you stop one day, you say, in the future, this will be the Suez Canal, so I won't walk further. If I cross over, I'm in the Middle East. So ancient Africa actually extended all the way to Western Asia. And so a lot of these people, a lot of things they do, for instance, what we do on Yom Kippur, we're white, that is an African ritual. A lot of people don't realize this. And so all the way through even to the history of circumcision, those are African rituals. There are many things that were East African. But once there's an ideological framework to erase Africans as agents of history, Judaism poses a big problem for that. Because you see, Judaism is not only steeped in Africanness, but at the same time, Judaism is also intimately linked to the emergence of Christianity.
Yeah.
So the problem is, how do you create a Christianity that's separate from Africanness and maintain a Jewish connection? And to make the matters worse, the early Christian fathers, Origen, Tertullian, St. Augustine, they were all Africans. And so a lot of this story is complicated. What began to create that rewriting that people tend to know as Western really began, it started to kick off around the 13th, but really after the 15th century. And at that period, the Christianity that was trying to understand its relationship to the past, now all the action took place on the northern side of the Mediterranean, because on the southern side, that was entirely dominated by Islam. But the problem was the Christians from that early period destroyed a lot of the early writings of the non-Christian and non-Jewish groups. And this is again complicated because you see a lot of the pagans, as they call them, they prefer to write in Greek, even though they spoke a lot of other language. It's just like if you go to, say, Colombia or Mexico, they prefer to write in Spanish.
Right.
However, the empire that was emerging, the Romans, they wrote in Latin. And it's just like, say today, Rome today is the US, so it's English. And so to signal they wanted the Romans to come in, those early Africans the Christian ones wrote in Latin. And that attracted in the Roman influence, you see? And so the crucial thing here then is, if you want to retell the history, the problem is they had already destroyed a lot of that early, that period in its formation. So they looked for an even earlier past. And that required a retroactive identification of Northern Europe with the ancient Mediterranean. And that rewrote that history.
Thank you. So we have one last question, and if you can, we have 5 minutes left, and I think we can squeeze it in. So this is from Ari. Can you say more about your position that Jews aren't white? we have a real investment in JVP in emphasizing that white Jews are white and that Jewish people of color are people of color as a strategy to undo the erasure of Jewish people of color, including Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews, which I think is something that I'm hearing in lots of different Jewish communities right now, you know, as we're struggling with our own internal racisms.
Well, it'll take a long time, more than 5 minutes, but the short answer is that you will find that Jews who try to maintain a white identity tend to maintain it among each other. When they go out into the rest of America, they find out they're not white real quick. I've met many Jews, Ashkenazi Jews who, I mean, we have to remember they're also Black Ashkenazi Jews. So let's just say those who are morphologically light. The issue for me is that there's a form of bad faith at work there, which is what's being masked is a real investment in whiteness. If there's a divestment in whiteness, then there's a different relationship that one can have with the rest of the Jewish world. And if many Jews in that divestment can understand the fluidity of racial identity, that they could be white in one place and not in others, just like, for instance, I'm Black here, but when I travel, it's crazy. There are places in which, for instance, I'm East Indian because I'm also of Tamil descent. There are places where I am Arab because I'm from people who left Jerusalem in the 19th century. They were Palestinian Jews. There are, you see what I'm saying? And what I say I am, I think I'm, just Lewis walking around. But I realize I don't always know what people see. And right now you're seeing one version of me, but when I'm, throughout my life, I go through many changes physically. But, and one of the funniest moments was one time I was in one of these carnivals where, they do those sketches. And I had the beard then, but if you sketch me without the color, you see me, they do black and white. I looked totally like a chassid, you see? And so, and my hair is up now, but I do have my pechons, you see? So the thing is, because of my background is more Orthodox oriented. And so the thing what I would say is that the big issue is, I do think that there is, at the level of Jewish values, at the question of liberation, something is lost with white investment. Because at the end of the day, even if you're not Black, you think about the world of liberation and justice differently when you divest yourself of whiteness, because it means addressing directly the question of colonial imposition, racism, degradation, and enslavement. In an essay, I brought it up this way. If you divest yourself of whiteness, what are you compelled to think about when you do a Seder? You don't say, even though you say the words when you were in Egypt, you think about contemporary slavery. Right. You think about what's happening in the world today.
Yeah. Well, I wish we had a whole other hour just to delve into that because I have so many thoughts, but I'm going to hold them for now. Can you actually share that article that you just mentioned? Because I think folks would be interested in reading more about that particular thread.
Sure. It's in a book. Oh, thank you, Gina. It's in a wonderful book on Jewish ethics. It's the title of it's by Curtis Hutt. You can find it through Routledge. Okay. And I'll send a little link to you. Great. So you can post it. But it has as a question mark. It's called Afro-Jewish Ethics ? There's another shorter essay I did, but I wrote it in French. So I'll have to have a translation, but I'll see about getting a translated version.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. And really from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. Really a pleasure for me. And I hope I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else, got something out of it. And thank you so much.
Thank you. And that's what it's about. Remember, first and foremost, we're reminded we're a community.
Yeah.
So for me, we just had to find a way.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll have more in the future.
Yes, would love that. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.